Hey everybody, it's Tim with Uniform Members for Christ, and we are back with another Genesis walkthrough video. We are in session 24, which we're only tackling Genesis 4:26 today, and I think you'll find out why as we go through this teaching. If you've never studied this, there are some complications potentially with the interpretation or the translation, and so I want to address a few of those. We're going to take it bit by bit. We're going to kind of do a exegetical kind of breakdown of this and see what we can learn about this passage and see what we can learn about why it's been translated the way it has, and is there any evidence that perhaps a slight adjustment to the wording would have been better. So let's read it, be on the screen as always. In Genesis 4:26 it says, "To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord." Now the name Seth, according to Strong's, means compensation or substituted. What I find intriguing is that it was not uncommon in biblical ancient times for parents to name their children either because the name held some kind of symbolic meaning, or perhaps the name would end up prophetic in nature. Now, to give you a modern example, my name is Tim, it's short for Timothy, which roughly translates to honored by God or beloved by God. Now, I'd love to say that my parents, and forgive me if you guys are watching this for saying this, but I'd love to say they had a prophetic insight or a prophetic foresight to know one day I would be beloved and honored by God, which is a really cool name to have. But I think actually my dad named me after one of his buddies. Still, I am very appreciative of the name. However, in ancient naming, we often find that let's use Eve for an example. She actually named her son Seth because she said, "God has appointed me another offspring." And what is she saying? Well, she's saying that there's an idea here that God has replaced, substituted, or might even think compensated her by giving her another son to replace Abel. In this instance, Seth. Now, we see many other examples in Scripture where people's name has a almost prophetic type of meaning. So when we read the name Noah, what we might not understand is that his name means comfort or rest. When we read the name Methuselah, what we might not understand is his name roughly translates to "his death shall bring." You may be familiar with the name Jacob, who Jacob later becomes Israel, but his name means heel grabber or supplanter. Now Isaac means he laughs or laughter, and Samuel, the prophet Samuel, if you'll remember, his name means God has heard. Now, each of these above stories confirms that the name was either a prophetic name or it was given to indicate a major event linked to the child. For example, let's take Methuselah. Now, some people see him as someone who received a prophetic name. Now, as I mentioned, his name roughly means "his death shall bring." Now, he had the longest life of anybody recorded. The year that he dies, the flood happens. Now, there are other instances where God changes a person's name for various reasons to signify something prophetic. For example, in Genesis 17, God changes Abram's name to Abraham. Now, whereas Abram meant exalted father, Abraham means father of a multitude. Very fitting, right? Since he would become the father of a multitude of nations. Exactly like God told him that he would in Genesis 17:5. Now, with those thoughts in mind, let's have a look back at Seth's son, Enosh. Now, if we only look at Blue Letter Bible, which I suggest on this channel frequently, it uses Strong's Concordance. Now, if we do that, we'll miss a bit of a deeper picture. Now, see, the Blue Letter Bible has the definition of Seth as man, which it is, but it holds a deeper meaning, as other Bible helps and commentators will point out. Now, I will tell you that there is a way to study deeper with other biblical concordances and interlinears, and some commentators get a little deeper into the words. There's Bible dictionaries. There's various methods to understand the nuances behind a Hebrew name, but just in this instance, you'll just have to look it up for yourself or take my word for it. The name Enosh, as I mentioned, it actually has a deeper sense, and that is man is frail or mortal. Now, this is not saying that Enosh was necessarily mortal or frail. Well, he was, but only in the sense that all humanity at this time, in general, was frail because of sin and because of the fall of the garden. Perhaps as the population increased, Seth began to recognize the frailty and morality of humanity and named his son with that in mind. Could it have been that he started seeing an infant mortality rate? Could it have been that there was death and premature death and all kinds of other murders and incidences that he was seeing that made him realize how frail and how fragile humanity was in light of how they had began with his father and mother? I would like to mention that there might be an interesting connection between Cain's naming of his firstborn son Enoch. Now, this is not the Enoch that we find later that was taken by God. This is Enoch whom Cain named his first city after, or his city after. And we might compare this with the fact that Seth named Enosh with its meaning. Now, I'm going to leave that up to you to investigate further because that would take a lot of digging, a lot more time in this video than I'm able to commit to it right now. But there could be a connection between those two. I'll let you dig that out. Now that brings us to the second half of verse 26, which is a very interesting passage and often interpreted in various ways. We're going to read it, okay? So at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Let's take this passage bit by bit and then we'll look at it as a whole. At that time. Now what time is this? Well, at the time of Enosh's birth. It seems as though his birth actually marked the beginning of a particular event. Perhaps in a similar way that Methuselah's birth marked a countdown of sorts until the global catastrophe we know as the flood. Now some commentators will suggest that this was a period of time marked by two separate groups. Those who identified themselves as belonging to God or called themselves by the name of God, and others who they would namely say would be in Cain's lineage that kind of did their own thing, so to speak. They'll point out the fact that Cain went and built a city and then they started doing building instruments and they're the modern inventors of a lot of kind of benefits to humanity, if you will, but it was mostly focused on that. And then they'll say, we contrast that with what we see with Seth. We're going to talk about that more in a minute. Is there really any evidence for that? Now, it's an interesting thought that we're dealing with two separate groups here. Let's call them the Sethites and the Cainites just for the sake of this video. We do find the concept of two distinct groups throughout the entire Bible. I'm going to list a few of them here for you. If we start with the idea of Cain and Abel, the Bible tells us that Cain was actually of the evil one, but his brother Abel's works were righteous. Now we find again with Esau and Jacob, two brothers, and Esau was the oldest. He had the birthright, but actually the Bible tells us later on that he was sexually immoral and that he despised his birthright. So his younger brother actually ends up inheriting the firstborn blessings. Now to carry this idea much further, we find similar comparisons between the first Adam, the man of the earth, and who Paul calls in 1 Corinthians and the book of Romans, the second Adam, or the man Jesus Christ, the man from heaven. Now, to take it away from specific people to a greater theme, we find that the Jews are God's chosen people from which the Messiah came, and then the Gentiles is a greater term that encompasses every other people group on earth. We find that throughout the Bible, okay? It's the Jews and then everybody else. Now the theme continues on today with those that would be the children of light and then the children of darkness. We might call them those that have been called out of darkness, as Paul talks about in the first chapter of the book of Colossians. Now the last one I'll mention is pretty interesting, and it's actually a concept of not people but cities. We have in the book of Revelation Mystery Babylon, almost contrasted with the New Jerusalem or the city of God. Now, Mystery Babylon is the great harlot, and it's this city that's full of abominations, whereas later we see New Jerusalem coming down, marking the time where God will reign on earth. Now, in light of those concepts, it would not at all be inconsistent to suggest that there were two groups of people on earth at this time, those who followed God and those who didn't. But does that really fit the overarching narrative? We'll discuss that more after we finish breaking down the passage. Next, we're going to talk about the phrase began to call, or people began to call. This section's a bit more complicated because to properly understand what's happening here, we need to have a basic understanding of the Hebrew language. The important thing to understand is that the Hebrew words carry a root meaning, but the context determines how we understand the word or interpret it. So you might have a root meaning that has a couple of different definitions, and then you might, from that definition, develop a new word from that root that carries a a specific meaning of one of those earlier definitions. That seems a little complicated the way I said it, but hopefully we can break that down here in a moment. Let's see if we can take a very basic look at the Hebrew word that we translate as to begin in Genesis 4:26. And let's see why some suggest that it should actually be began to profane instead of begin to call. Now, the word in question is actually, and I'm going to let Mr. Strong say this word for me since I can now pronounce the Hebrew like he can, so I'm going to be quiet where you can hear this.
Strong's H, 2490, Chalel, Chalel.
That's a fun word, right? It's got the chalel. It's a little hard for us speakers that primarily just speak English. The interesting part about this word is that according to Strong's concordance, it's translated as began 52 times throughout the Old Testament and as profane 36 times throughout the Old Testament. Now, the primary meaning of the word, the 52 times, the primary meaning is to begin, and the secondary meaning would be to profane. So what led the translators to use the word begin, or translate it as begin, instead of begin to profane? Well, it's clear that the birth of Enosh marks some sort of transition for humanity. Now, some translators, or some theologians will say that, Cain's descendants are those who have, as I mentioned earlier, for lack of a better word, they're kind of carnal. They built their own world system. They have their own kind of religious identity. And then they will look at the birth of Seth and then his son Enosh, and they'll say, well, clearly Seth is separate from Cain, and we can put Cain into one group and Seth into another. Now, Jamieson Fawcett Brown, as you know, I will often mention in my videos, they said this about this phrase that we find in Genesis 4:26. Then people began to call upon the name of the Lord. They said, God's people, a name probably applied to them in contempt by the world. I know that's a little confusing because this verse has been interpreted in various ways. So men began to call upon the name of the Lord. That's not only like, hey, God, it also can mean like they identified themselves as those who belong to God, or their religious system was built on the idea of we belong to God, or perhaps even other people begin to call them those who followed God. Now, that's one possible explanation, okay? That's one possible interpretation of this passage. Now, Dr. Chuck Missler comments on this passage in his Genesis commentary walkthrough, and I've linked the applicable sections of that video for you in the description with the timestamps. Now, Adam Clark comments at length, as he often did on most passages, and he does acknowledge the common interpretation, but then he includes another section, and it's from the Treatise on Idolatry by Maimonides. I want to briefly talk to you about Maimonides because we probably need to understand why I would even reference a Jewish sage and his treatise on idolatry. Okay. What is a sage, first of all? Well, it's a term that's describing a person of exceptional wisdom and learning, especially in the study of the scripture and Jewish laws. Now, he lived in the medieval period from about 1138 to 1204 and is widely regarded as one of the greatest Jewish thinkers in history. Maimonides was not only a rabbi, but also a philosopher, a theologian, and a physician. His writings systematized much of Jewish theology and ethics for later generations. So if you think about like systematic theology, the books that we study in college, he would have kind of grouped together teachings that would have helped form later theology and ethics. Now, you might wonder why, as Christians, should we care what a Jewish rabbi from the Middle Ages had to say? And that answer is simple. Maimonides was commenting on the same Old Testament scriptures that we're reading right now, and he was commenting in their original Hebrew context. His perspective helps us understand how Jewish scholars, closer to the language and cultural roots of the text, understood passages that we sometimes only see through later translations or, interpretations of the Hebrew text. Now, we are not looking to him for doctrine or theology, of course, from a Christian sense, but we can certainly benefit from his historical and linguistic insights. Now, he interprets the phrase, then men began to call upon the name of the Lord, that we find in Genesis 4:26 as the commencement of idolatry. So he would be in the camp of men began to profane the name of the Lord. According to Maimonides, this was the pivotal moment when humanity initiated the practice of invoking God's name inappropriately, which led to the establishment of idolatrous worship. Now, he suggested that over time, this misapplication of God's name evolved into the worship of the stars and other celestial bodies, marking the onset of idolatry among mankind. Now, I find this very intriguing because we do have ancient accounts of the worship of the heavens dating as far back as the ancient Sumerians. We'll say they were from about 4,000 years to about 2,000 years before Christ in that dynasty. To give you some biblical perspective, we can potentially place the Tower of Babel incident somewhere around 2,500 years before Christ. Keep in mind, these are rough, approximate dates. Even most scholars wrestle with these, and it's difficult to pinpoint a date. But we could probably be safe within a couple hundred years on either side of saying about 2,500 years before Christ. Now, there are actually ancient cuneiform tablets of the Sumerians that have a list of their celestial deities that they worshipped that were approximately 2,600 to 2,500 years before Christ. These are really ancient documents dating back not far from the Tower of Babel. So just so you know, it wasn't uncommon at all, even after the earth has been flooded, after a new group of people rise up from the lineage of Noah, it wasn't long before they got right back into some pretty despicable behavior, even after God had punished the earth. Okay, so why are we even discussing the possibility that this verse might be better viewed in the light of profaning God's name instead of worshiping God? Well, that is what I wrestled with. Is there even a point in looking at this apart from what, let's say, the King James Version already has it translated? And perhaps had it not been for Dr. Chuck Missler, I probably wouldn't have even thought about this. But as I'm starting to study this, I realize he's not alone. He's not in a bubble and in a box with his theories. He's actually pulling upon a lot of ancient documents and a lot of earlier texts to build this picture. And so the idea here is the early translators took a concept of context. What do I mean by that? Well, they essentially said, hey, it's clear that Cain was rejected, so he goes out and builds this city. And then they make the assumption that everybody in the lineage of Cain must be just like Cain was, right? Which is probably not fair to them, but that's what happened. Dr. Missler argues from a different perspective, but I'll leave that to you if you watch his video. And then they say, well, obviously Seth was the one who was replacing Abel, so clearly he was righteous. And so essentially what was happening with Seth there is that the Messiah would come through his line. He wasn't coming through the lineage of Cain or the family of Cain, so he had to come through another son. Cain had been rejected, but somebody had to replace Abel, so God gave Adam and Eve Seth to replace Abel, and the Messiah came through the lineage of Seth. Now, how much time do you think passes between, let's say, Genesis 4:26 and the 6th chapter of Genesis? Well, when we see Noah in that period, it's about 800 years between Enosh and Noah. Now, these are approximate, okay? This could be 50, 60, 70 years. Okay, I'm just giving you approximate dates. But that much time has passed. Now, chapter 5, the context there is just genealogy. It just gives us the ages and the sons. And then chapter 6, immediately we see that the sons of God came down and took the daughters of men. And then immediately we see the earth is absolutely corrupted in verse 5. We'll read that in a moment. So there's not a lot of context to pull from. All we know is that about 800 years has passed from Enosh to Noah. And then we'll call it about 1,000 years until maybe the flood, 1,100, somewhere in there. And humanity is absolutely, utterly wicked. Now I want to read something for you from Hebrews 3:10. It'll be on the screen. Therefore I was provoked with that generation and said, they always go astray in their heart. They have not known my ways. Now this is God speaking, or God's being quoted. And his words are actually about the children of Israel during their days of wandering in the wilderness after the Exodus from Egypt. Now, this didn't only happen to the ancient Israelites, but this is a warning for every one of us as Christians that we need to be aware that this going astray in our heart can happen to us as well. And guys, I got to stop and just tell you, there's some really dangerous doctrine out there that does not warn you to watch and pray and be on guard, that you could get pulled away by deception from the living God. There's a lot of dangerous doctrine out there where people want to make you really comfortable in your sin instead of challenging you to live a holy life for God. You just got to really be careful. It's easy to be in a comfortable environment where you get complacent and you just assume that everything's all right, but read the Bible for yourself, read the warnings for yourself, and allow a righteous, holy fear of God to rise up within you so that it will drive you to spend time with Him and pray and hear Him in His scriptures and hear Him in prayer so that you'll know how to better follow Him. Whole groups of denominations have been pulled off into apostasy and into heretical doctrine because most of the people just assumed the person behind the pulpit had their best interest in mind, whereas that person was just parroting something somebody else had said. And nobody ever stopped to wrestle with the scriptures on their own. And entire denominations have went off the rails because of that. So I just really encourage you to get in the Bible and ask God what His scriptures mean to you and to your family, and how you can be on guard and safeguard yourself and your family, your wife and your children by knowing Him and knowing His word rightly divided. Okay, so the writer of Hebrews is warning us that, hey, this didn't only happen to the ancient Israelites, but here's a modern application. 2 verses later, in verse 12, he says, "Take care, brothers, lest there be any of you with an evil, unbelieving heart that leads you to fall away from the living God." How much clearer does it need to be for us to realize that we can fall away from the living God? Notice this, he's saying take care, brothers. This is not a term that's implied or applied to the world, but only those who profess faith in Jesus Christ. Paul talks about that in the book of Corinthians. If there is any brother among you who names himself as a brother, who calls himself basically a servant of God, that is sexually immoral, he says don't even have a meal with them. So this term brothers is meant specifically for those who profess to know Christ. And he said, be careful, take care, pay attention, because you could have an evil, unbelieving heart in you that leads you to fall away from the living God, just like the children of Israel, when they were tested over and over and over in the wilderness, kept rejecting God by unbelief. So we actually see a universal principle that was instituted after the rebellion at the tree in the garden. You know, everything went from order to chaos. Now today we start with disorder and we move toward order, but it requires energy and effort. And we have to put the effort in to remain orderly. Now, the tendency for us is to drift toward disorder. In a most basic application, we find this in our workplaces, our workspaces, my desk, for instance, which constantly goes from order to disorder. Or here in our homes, you know, someone has to clean dishes, fold laundry, wash cars, clean up, etc. You know, it's amazing to me how many kids we do foster care, and they come here, and I think, and most of you are parents, so you probably realize this, most of them think that somehow, maybe like a Disney movie, that magically something happens in this house where it just cleans itself. You know, they just don't really understand how much effort it takes to make something orderly and to clean up a space. So that's part of what we have to teach kids, and that's also what pastors and teachers and ministers in the church have to teach the flock, is how to remain orderly, or things don't just magically happen. We have to actually be intentional with our spiritual life. You know, just like our homes, if we neglect them, soon we'll find ourselves tripping over things that have been on the floor and assuming it was somebody else's responsibility to pick it up. Instead of taking responsibility for ourselves, picking it up out of the floor, folding it, cleaning it, washing it, doing whatever, and putting it away. Well, it's the same thing with our spiritual life. If we assume it's somebody else's responsibility, let's say a pastor or teacher, to feed us all the time and to hear from God on our behalf, we may find our spiritual house in a condition where it's out of order, right? So we have to be responsible. We have an obligation of our own spiritual life. And I'm very thankful for pastors. I'm very thankful for teachers. But I did a little post one time on Facebook that actually told you the amount of hours the average Christian spends in a building getting any kind of instruction. And the numbers were absolutely minuscule compared to the amount of time that your kid goes to a school 8 hours a day. And even subtracting summers, even with, if you assume that you took your kid on a Sunday morning and then a Wednesday night, let's assume an hour each, but that's not really practical instruction. There's a lot of other stuff that goes on in there. You're getting I won't use the word negligible, but you're getting a tiny amount of instruction, biblical instruction and other things. So really we have an obligation to do things on our own in our own home that will build us up spiritually. Okay, so let's look at what any of that has to do with Genesis 4:26. Now, as I mentioned before, there's approximately 800 years from Enosh to Noah, and about a rough estimate of 1,000 years, maybe 1,100 before Enosh and the flood. That's scholars disagree on all of this, so I'm just giving you a rough estimate. Now, in Genesis 6:5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of their heart, was only evil continuously. Now, it is granted that 1,000 years is a long time, right? If we go 1,000 years back from here, we're firmly in the medieval period. But what do we find has happened during this 1,000-year period? Well, we don't find two separate groups, that's for sure. We don't find let's call them the Cainites again and the Sethites. The Bible lumps everybody in together in one big old pile and calls them utterly wicked. Now, we know that only one person was righteous, and that was who? I know you said it from home, all right? That was Noah. Good job. Now, if the supposed Sethites had somehow distinguished themselves from the Cainites, it certainly didn't last. And if that were the case, the Bible is oddly silent on what happened. Now, you know me, I would be glad to take you to the New Testament if there was any evidence to show you that there was two distinct groups. And maybe as I'm studying, I'll find something, or if you know something, please drop it in the comments below. But I just don't see the evidence that there were two separate groups. I do understand that is an overarching biblical theme, and it makes a strong argument, but we just seem to lack direct biblical evidence. Essentially, all we know is that from Enosh to Noah, everybody on earth was absolutely corrupted. That's all we know. Let's consider Genesis 6:12. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. So does the immediate context surrounding Genesis 4:26 suggest that there are now two people groups on earth, those who call upon God in a positive sense, perhaps in the line of Seth, and those who reject God and build their own system, perhaps Cain and his descendants? Well, as I mentioned, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence for that, but it is a very interesting and compelling argument. Or does it imply the beginning of a period of time when humanity begins to profane the name of God? Now, something I realize is I haven't broken down and defined from a biblical perspective the word profane, and we need to do that real quick. It actually means to desecrate, violate, or treat, pay really close to this, as common. Guys, the name of God should be reverenced. And it should be something, I prayed a little while back, I said, Father, I have said the name Jesus so frequently that it almost it doesn't quite hold the same, reverence and awe that it did at one time. And I was like, Father, I need help getting back to a place where I can say Jesus' name with a awe, with a reverence, worshipfully, and not, because you just hear it so common, and then you hear people just disrespect it. It's like people just don't reverence and respect the name of Jesus like they did. Now, a lot of us Christians do, but even within within our group, I find that we have to be intentional when we think about his name. And so the second definition is to misuse or dishonor something that is sacred. We don't talk about the sacred anymore. We don't talk about what it really means to have a reverence and an awe of God and a reverence and an awe of Jesus. We don't really talk about those things. And as a community, we really don't focus on those things. So I think it can be difficult to understand that something is sacred, set apart, holy. It's hard to understand those terms. But when we apply this concept to calling upon the name of the Lord, which is the last part of verse 26 that we'll look at today, it could mean acting in ways that violate the holiness and, the reputation of God. Now, this can include idolatrous practices, because let's look at what Maimonides said. He said that the people of that day began to worship stars, celestial bodies, perhaps Jupiter, that's common in celestial worship. They began to build temples, and they would call God or their idols by the name of God. Okay, so they would get into idolatry, and they would make an image and they would worship it and say, hey, this is your God. Now, that happened as well in the book of Exodus, I think maybe chapter 32, at the golden calf incident, right? When it came out, he says, hey, worship this. This is the God that brought you out oh man, it's hard to even say this, but this is the God that brought you out of Egypt. So you can see how this could happen. And by the way, just as a very quick side note, in the book of Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is given this huge discourse to the Jews right before he's stoned to death, he mentions that the Israelites had actually taken up the tent of Moloch, and actually the star of their god, and I think it's Raphan, Rephan, I think it is. We know that idolatrous practices, as evidenced by the golden calf, were not uncommon for the Israelites, especially those who had been heavily influenced by the Egyptians, who worshipped bulls, cobras, various other creatures, along with the stars. Now, the next thing that it means to profane the name of God is a moral corruption. It's like saying, hey, I belong to Jesus, but then you're morally corrupt. So you're not really representing him the way he wants to be represented, the way he deserves, rather, to be represented. Now, you can also misuse God's name by claiming God's favor while acting in rebellious ways. Okay, and then the last one, misusing God's commandments for self-serving acts. It reminds me of a passage, I'm trying to think of who wrote it, but it says that there were these teachers, these leaders who crept into women's houses, women that were overcome and overburdened with the sin, and they actually convinced them that one of the ways that they could get rid of their sins was through like sensual behavior. It's a New Testament thing that there were wicked false prophets who actually did that. And that kind of reminds me, they actually used God's commandments against these people. And this is not only a unique occurrence that happened in the New Testament early period of the 1st, 2nd century. No, we're talking about modern people do this. You could find some pretty horrible examples on YouTube of so-called prophets, so-called apostles, misusing their platform and God's commands for their own disgusting sensual purposes. So, you might find it very interesting that the 10 Commandments expressly forbids taking God's name vainly. Now, we traditionally view this as not using God's name as a cuss word, which unfortunately so many people do, and they misuse the name of Jesus all the time. Now, certainly that is inappropriate, but the idea of not taking God's name vainly, it means don't take his name casually or carelessly, because one day you're going to be held accountable for that. In other words, when we profane the name of God, we're not only misusing his name, but it can be that we are created in his image and his likeness, and we say, hey, I belong to God, I belong to Jesus, but then we do not act in ways that properly represent the name that we call ourselves by, or in this instance, Christians. Basically, you want to be a good representative of the one you claim to serve. Now, often in this house, the children that come and live here in foster care, we talk to them all the time about the name, my name, that's important to me. And my wife is proud to have a good name. I'm proud to have a good name. I'm proud of the name that my parents have created for us. And I want these kids to realize you're representing myself and my wife in many instances when you're at school and when you're in other places, and I expect a certain type of behavior from you. And is that too much to say that that's exactly how us as the children of God are expected to behave by our Father in heaven? When we're at work and in the public sphere, how should we be reacting? How should we be acting? As representatives of God, good representatives that have the Word of God, and we walk in truth. So the modern translators have translated Genesis 4:26 as people begin to call upon, in the sense of people begin to use God's name for worship, or perhaps people begin to identify their relationships with God by calling themselves by his name. It might be similar to the sense where people who believed in Jesus were originally called Christians at Antioch. We find that in the book of Acts, chapter 11, verse 26. From what I understand, the title was given to Christians not as a compliment, but as an insult or in a derogatory manner. But later, it was adopted by Christians to identify themselves with Christ. Could this be what happened in Genesis 4:26? Did another group of people identify those who followed God by perhaps a derogatory name, or maybe they called them by God's name in some type of way to identify them, but not in a positive way, but almost as an insult? That's hard to know. We have 800 to 1,000 years, as I've mentioned, and during that time, it was absolutely corrupted, the whole earth. So if there was a line of righteous and a line of unrighteous, well, they merged together effectively, and by that period, there's only one person that's right in God's eyes. So it really doesn't matter what they called themselves by anyway. Obviously, they didn't follow through with actually following God. If that group were the ones that followed God, they ended up profaning his name anyway. So I guess either way you look at it, it didn't work out. And then the second question is, do we really have enough evidence to suggest the passage would be better interpreted to mean people started to use God's name profanely, or as Maimonides has suggested, man began to call their idols by the name of God, therefore using it profanely? Again, there seems to be a solid lack of evidence. If I were leaning one direction, which is probably appropriate since I teach these things, I would probably lean a little toward the men began to profane the name of God. And really, because the greater context of what we're going to see between Genesis 4:26 and chapter 6, which again is a lengthy period of time, humanity has corrupted their way completely. Nobody's righteous. They're all violent and utterly wicked. Their heart is completely strayed from God, with the exception of one man, Noah, as I've mentioned several times. And so it seems to lend more credibility to the fact that men got into idolatrous practices. Perhaps they did build temples pre-flood. Perhaps they did sacrifice. The earth was filled with violence, is what the scriptures tell us in Genesis chapter 6. So now clearly there was a lot of bloodshed upon the earth, so much so that God had regretted that he had even created humans and was about to wipe them out entirely. I know that was a lot, and I told you one verse is sometimes very sufficient if you're taking it and you're doing an expositional type teaching or your exegetical type teaching. Sometimes I'm at 45 minutes right now in this video, which is about 20 minutes longer than I like to generally put my videos out. So I might have to do 2 parts on this, I'm not sure. But anyway, as always, may the Lord bless you with an increased knowledge of his nature, of his will, of his purposes for you as you study his word, and he reveals himself and his son and his spirit to you through his word. And I just take care, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.